Good afternoon. Very warm welcome from Zurich. My name is Renat Heuberger. I'm the CEO and the co-founder of the South Pole Group, and I'm very happy to spend the next couple of minutes with you talking about the topic that has just been ranked by the World Economic Forum as the number one topic in terms of risks, namely climate change and the environment. Here with me in the room is also our head of consultancy, Franziska Sinner.
Hello, everyone.
And Franziska will also be able to answer questions later on. As for questions, maybe ask you to populate the box that you can see on your panel. Send us your question in writing so we can answer them and address them at the end. So the agenda is divided in three sections. First of all, we are going to talk a little bit about the COP22 in Marrakesh, what happened actually there. The second topic will take us to the United States. We'll talk a little bit about Donald Trump. And we will then continue to hopefully a little bit more inspiring topic, which is what does this all mean for the private sector? What are the drivers and trends in a post-Paris world? So let's kick off with the COP22. Some of you may have read in the news that not much happened at COP22, and indeed it was a little bit of a so-called a hangover COP. And the hangover COP happens whenever a big success had been celebrated just the COP before. Obviously, we had the Paris Agreement the year before, so a lot of governments were kind of meeting again to celebrate that success and to pave the way forward. And then very obviously in the middle of the COP, in the first week actually, the whole conference was caught by shock regarding the US election. Nobody had expected that, obviously. And throughout the COP, you could really see a kind of a transition from shock to fear, to reassurance, and even to defiance in the end. And in the end, my conclusion was that the Paris momentum actually remains. And in a certain sense, and we'll talk about this later on, you could even say the Paris momentum was in a way reinforced by everybody noticing that now is the time to really get this done because Trump won't help, so everybody else really needs to get the act together. On the content itself, not surprisingly, actually, there was not much progress. This is not surprisingly because there were no real agenda items on the table of significance that would where progress was expected in the first place. But what is important for all of us here is that we should look ahead to 2018 in a little bit less than 2 years from now. There's going to be COP24 in Poland. And the timetable that is active right now suggests that by the time the parties will meet in Poland, they will then be there to hammer out the details as to how Paris is operationalized. What does it really mean? How does Paris really work? And again, that's the key issue on the table. I'll have a few words on that in a second. So for now, to sum up, NDCs, the pledges of governments are still far away from the 2 degrees target, but they're also, they show a good level of ambition. It's not sufficient, but it's significant. On a negative note, pre-2020 ambition, which actually would be very important because we're losing time every year, pre-2020 ambition was not a topic at all, and it doesn't seem like a lot of state level pre-2020 ambition will be seen very soon. And also on a maybe not negative note, but a cautious note, the ambiguity and the complexity of Paris became clearer than they were even before. So let's recap quickly what Paris really has entailed. One of the most important elements is the target, well below 2 degrees warming, ideally 1.5 degrees. Later in the presentation, we will see what that means. It essentially means a full decarbonization of the world, which is massive. It's a massive transition that is in this legally binding agreement. Okay. And at the center, and this is really, if you want to remember one single acronym here, then you should remember NDC, because that's the big show in town, nationally determined contributions. That's the centerpiece of Paris. Unlike Kyoto, which came with binding targets for industrialized countries, Paris comes with national pledges, national contributions, and all 195 signatories to Paris are essentially free to come up with their own pledge. Paris also says that NDCs have to be revised every 5 years, increasing the ambition. So every 5 years, we will hopefully see governments getting together and actually not only reporting on what they've achieved, but also to flesh out what they're going to achieve next in an increased target. Also reconfirmed 100 billion per year commitment by developed countries for climate finance. That was a very important bargaining chip also to win countries across the line and ensure that Paris was a success. And for those of you in the call who are somewhat linked to markets, there is, of course, Article 6, which is important for all of us. It established the rule of market mechanisms. And the good news for those of you who are active there is that Article 6 is actually quite explicit about how and what role markets should play. And last but not least, Paris also includes text and language on avoided deforestation and land degradation. But once again, and that's again a little bit of a negative point, we're discussing about this since many years. The concept of REDD Plus is now 10 years old, and even after 10 years, we still have no real operational system in place on how that would look like. And sometimes you wonder if it wasn't possible to flesh it out in 10 years. How many more years will have to pass until more clarity on REDD, and therefore also for REDD finance comes into play. Then nearly as important as, and actually in case of Marrakesh, in my view, even more important than what happened in the conference area was actually what happened on the sidelines. And there we really have some very, very, very interesting news, which all of you should see here on one slide. First of all, just before Marrakesh started in September, there was a breakthrough in the aviation sector. The aviation has been kept out of the Kyoto Protocol. So aviation has always been out, along with shipping, by the way. And the International Civil Aviation Organization, ICAO, which is another UN body, finally adopted a system called CORSIA. And CORSIA essentially means that from 2021, all further growth in carbon emissions from air traffic will have to be carbon neutral. So essentially, emissions of aviation are capped at 2021 levels. That is pretty groundbreaking. And the ICAO also has a very ambitious timeline. By 2018, they also are supposed to come up with the details. Another very important topic that was not really taken up much by the media was that there was a small amendment to the Montreal Protocol, which is about ozone depleting substances, the Kigali Amendment. And it increased the list of substances that will simply be phased out. And it's including these substances, HFCs, which are very potent greenhouse gases. So we have now a whole range of greenhouse gases which are essentially taken out of the system by simply having a global agreement that these substances are illegal. So that's a very simple amendment with a very significant impact. More points. We have a coalition of 48 countries which commit to 100% renewables by 2050. So as a sign that some of the small, especially smaller states, vulnerable states, are actually taking action first. And then a coalition that I think you should also really keep in mind is this Nazca coalition. We're coming back later on this non-state topic when we talk about Trump, by the way. But for now, to see Nazca is basically a platform which monitors commitments of everybody else outside of national governments, including investors, companies, cities, regions, and so on. And if you browse through this platform, it's really amazing what is already been happening even without outside of state level action. And you can see some of these points on the list here. I'm not going to read out all of them. For example, there's 20 investors of more than 3.2 trillion, which commit to decarbonization of their assets. You have a massive amount of companies and also cities and regions who came up with pledges here. And then, last but not least, another key driver, which was in a way surrounding the COP, was that also last year, once again, the price of renewables is simply in sharp decline. So even outside of all these national commitments, state commitments, and so on, we simply also have drive and push from, or I should say pull actually, from the fact that renewables simply get less and less expensive and become more and more competitive. So where are we heading? And this sounds simple here on the sheet, but it's anything else but very simple. We have to get these NDCs right. And frankly speaking, a lot of work is lying ahead of negotiators because there's a couple of very difficult topics to be solved around accounting of these nationally determined contributions, about the governance of them, about ambition, who is ultimately negotiating, or can any country just pledge whatever it wants, or is there at some point a certain guidance on how ambition should look like? Then, of course, you have a lot of detailed questions which are quite complicated. How will market mechanisms work in a world where 195 countries have an opportunity to basically pledge whatever they want to pledge? How can you launch market mechanisms in this fragmented world? And also an interesting question, we had aviation before. Now, if aviation is supposed to grow in a carbon neutral way, the aviation industry has to offset somehow. So how is that going to happen inside the Paris world where any offset is somebody's is basically counting also to national target? How can you avoid double counting? This sounds like a very theoretical question, but it's about a lot of money and about a lot of thoughts how to separate these systems and to ensure that the counting works and there is no double counting. And then, of course, we have a question around leadership, which I'll postpone for now because that's what we are going to talk about right now. Again, in the middle of the COP 2020, there was this somewhat shocking announcement that we will have a man as the next president of the United States, who says, and you can see this tweet here, "This very expensive global warming bullshit has got to stop. Our planet is freezing, record low temps, and our global warming scientists are stuck in ice." So that's what reading these tweets is of course not very encouraging for the crowd. But on the same page, you can also read a quote which is as recent as November 2016, which the New York Times published, where Trump says, "I've received so many environmental awards for the way I've done, I've done a tremendous amount of work where I've received tremendous numbers. Sometimes I'll say I'm actually an environmentalist, and people will smile in some cases, and other people that know me understand it's true, open minds." So hang on, he also considers himself an environmentalist. And we just picked the two basically quotes here, but we have a long list. If you want, we can send them through from funny and interesting Trump tweets and expressions. And the long story very short, our conclusion is it's totally pointless in trying to interpret too much into what Donald Trump actually says. Arguably, what he says is PR, and so much more interesting than what Trump actually says, because we can really not derive much, is let's become a bit more nimble and let's assess for a second, what harm can Trump really cause? What is it that he could really do if he wanted to? Again, this is a very long list, and we picked a few items just to get you all into thinking mode. You will see that the conclusion here is, whenever you hear something, this Trump said this and Trump said that, think twice and think carefully. Is it really true, and how is this issue connected to other issues? Some examples. Trump could stop payments to climate change funds, and he made that very clear. At the moment, for example, 45% of the IPCC are covered by the US, and if Trump stops paying that, somebody else has to come up with these funds. And interesting news, by the way, we just heard today. It's so new that we have had no chance to put it in the slide. President Obama, which he today is still president, he announced today that he would pay another $500 million into the Green Climate Fund, bringing the American contribution now to $1 billion. So that's a start, and apparently this money is already paid. It can't be withheld, so it's not going to come back. America has actually done a share of its contribution, but still, going forward, Trump could cut funding. He could also create alliances with climate skeptics, and in my view, one of the most dangerous ones is actually Vladimir Putin. The simple reason is that, as many of you certainly know, Russia is one of the very few countries which actually is benefiting quite massively from climate change. If the global climate is warming up, you will have vast amounts of areas in Siberia which currently are impossible to farm as new farmlands. That's a boost for the economy of Russia. So Russia is among the winners here, and an alliance with Putin could well lead to a coalition of powerful governments who is trying to block the further progress. Another issue we picked here was, and certainly I've seen this with all his tweets, Donald Trump causes a lot of uproar at the Wall Street. For example, when the day after his election, shares of solar companies and wind companies fell, while shares of energy companies, fossil fuel companies, increased by more than 50%. In the meantime, that have, of course, softened a little bit. But of course, such an environment brings uncertainties to investors. And again, we will see in a second why it's actually, this could in a way harm the current movement we have, which goes actually into the other direction, where investors more and more firmly gather behind climate change action and more align their investments with the 2-degree targets. And then a completely different element here. Paris was also a success because there was quite a lot of focus on getting it done. And you can only get 195 countries in the room if you don't have other issues that are overriding climate change in terms of priority. For example, a trade war. It's not good to negotiate about climate change if a big trade war between governments is raging on. Iran, I mean, if Donald Trump decides to take back the deal on Iran, and we would basically start a new proliferation of nuclear weapons and so on, that topic, that security topic, would also most probably override the priority that governments currently give to climate change. So that's another risk, that Trump simply changed the agenda with other topics that are sidetracking us again from the problem that has been singled out as the most risky one by the World Economic Forum just a few days ago. But now let's also see what Trump cannot do, even if you think he could. There's actually quite a long list as well of things that you may think, ooh, this is dangerous, but actually he can't change much. And I'm starting with state and regional laws. There are just a few examples. California has one of the strictest vehicle standards. So even if Trump tries to promote car making, that consumes more fossil fuels, no matter, regardless of the question to whom that brings any benefit, you don't have the choice because California still has that law, and you can't just change that. There is other complicated rules in the United States which are around water, for instance, where there is rules that govern how tribal land is used, how regions and on county level what rights people have. So just eliminating an EPA rule may not do much because you have other sets of rules which are simply still in place and you can't just change them. So it's not that easy then just revoke a legislation on state level, on federal level, because on state level you may still have a variety of other regulations. Another interesting topic. Trump was, for instance, a lot of voted in by a lot of people who are active in the coal industry. Now, Donald Trump also says that he wants to massively ramp up American oil and gas production. What doesn't seem to be so clear is that if you ramp up oil and gas production in the United States, the biggest loser is actually not the environment. The biggest loser is coal. Because more further drilling and further oil and gas will drive down the price of oil and gas even further and will make gas even more competitive compared to coal. So by drilling, he's actually working against the interests of the coal industry. And what this example shows is that, it's easy to announce, I'm going to support this, I'm going to support that. If you look carefully, you will see that there is side effects that could actually achieve the opposite of what you had in mind in the beginning. And that doesn't fit very well into the simplistic picture that Donald Trump is sometimes painting. But we don't have to worry too much. For us, what we can take away from that is that it's most probably more complicated than just supporting coal and supporting oil. That's for us the takeaway message here. Another one is Donald Trump promised to cancel the climate deal. Now, this is an interesting one because the backbone of Paris, of course, Paris was signed by 195 governments, but the backbone is actually a deal back from 2014 between China and the United States. And now China has a vital interest, as we will see in a second also, of basically reducing emissions. They have a big air pollution problem. So China already announced that they wouldn't just let the United States just off the hook. So it's going to be interesting to see, out of all the potential conflicts Donald Trump could be entering into, whether a fight with China on the climate deal is among his top priorities. So it's not that easy. And by the way, even if Donald Trump did basically not honor his commitment under Paris, the impact of that wouldn't be that great at all because, as we said in the very beginning, Paris is a binding agreement, but Paris is essentially based on so-called NDCs, nationally determined contribution. So from the outset, every country is free anyway to pledge whatever it wants. So the impact of withdrawing is not massive because the least you can do is to pledge nothing, and that's the most damage you can do. So that's not that easy. And then another one that is actually quite interesting. The threatening of renewable power technologies by cutting in incentives is another one which doesn't have legs, because if you threaten to remove subsidies, it's going to take a while until that takes effect. So in the short run, that could even lead to a boom of renewables, because now promoters of renewables have an end date, and they know if I don't get my project financed by 2018 or whatever it is, I'm going to drop out. So that's another one which may sound easy, but potentially could have an opposite impact of what we believe. And I know this slide is a bit provocative, but there's even some elements which, in hindsight, if you look back in history in a few years from now, we could, in hindsight, come to the conclusion that actually Donald Trump was our true climate hero. I mentioned state and city level laws. Now, with a Trump government, all of a sudden, if you're a mayor of a democratic city or a governor of a democratic state, all of a sudden, you have now much more incentive to look very carefully what you can actually do in spite of federal law. So in a way, the fear of Donald Trump removing and messing around with environmental legislation actually triggers a lot of thinking power on state level, on city level, to now see what can we actually do to promote climate action. So Trump, in a certain sense, inspires all of these people, and including us. Another element here is Paris itself. If you compare Paris and Kyoto, Kyoto took 8 years to enter into force. Paris took less than 1 year to enter into force. Why is that? One reason, arguably, is that everybody was so much in fear of a Trump presidency that countries were just speeding it up and ensuring that Obama can still sign, it's going to enter into force. So arguably, Trump, the first action he caused was actually a speeding up of the Paris Agreement. We already mentioned the third point quickly about the expiring subsidies, or actually it's not a subsidy, it's a tax cut for renewables. Another one, an interesting one, is actually infrastructure spending. Donald Trump also pledged a lot of money for infrastructure, 500 billion. And arguably, a good share of this infrastructure investments will be invested in transmission lines. Now, transmission lines, especially high voltage line, the supergrid, for instance, is actually a limiting factor for renewables. So arguably, Donald Trump's infrastructure investments could well remove the biggest barrier that renewable energies currently face, namely the fact that they are decentralized in nature and power has to be transported from one place to the other. So summing up, Donald Trump, what to expect? Yes, it's shocking sometimes, and every day we can open the news portals in the morning and potentially, and every other day there's a new shock in the news block. But all of us, we shouldn't be too bamboozled about that. The analysis of his statements and intentions are actually very complex. Again, I'm not wanting to paint a bright picture. Some of his actions may actually be indeed very damaging for climate change, but many things that Donald Trump pretends he's doing are either undoable or are much more complex than he says, and some of them are actually even promoting environmental causes. So at the moment, it's impossible to draw conclusions. Once again, my key message is don't fall into the trap that he would like us to fall in, namely to believe his peer stunts. Analyze, assess, and get to the bottom of the issue. So with this, we now come to the third and the last part of the presentation, which is the relevance of all this for the private sector and markets, and obviously the drivers and trends in the post-Paris world. And to start off, let's again recap. So Donald Trump is most probably not a real driver. So who else will be a driver? Here's a quote coming from China, also from November. Change in US policy won't affect China's commitment to support climate negotiations and also the implementation of the Paris Agreement. China at the moment could easily fill in the leadership vacuum left by Obama USA, and I have to say also by the EU. That's another topic about which we could talk long now. Of course, the EU with Brexit and all other topics is also not in a very good shape to take on strong leadership on climate change, on the fight against climate change. China could fill in the leadership gap, and the key driver there obviously is not that China is now governed by Greenpeace and WWF, but that in the meantime, pollution in big cities like Beijing or Guangzhou are so bad that this is actually now a serious threat for the Communist Party of China. So they have to do something. And pollution and the burning of fossil fuels, especially coal, is one of the key reasons, combined, of course, with vehicles, is one of the key reasons for their problems, and therefore also for China's climate and energy plans. And China has a couple of big plans. I mentioned the supergrid before. China is, for instance, massively speeding up ultra high voltage transmission lines, which are again one of the key obstacles hindering renewables. So it's interesting to see what technological advances also come through these Chinese plans. Another thing is that the vast majority of other nations so far remain fully committed to Paris, at least for now. We mentioned the other driver already, subnational and corporate climate action. And then we have a couple of key non-political drivers, of which we will highlight a few in a second, namely tangible risks for investors and also the advancing of technologies. Before we jump into a few of these drivers in more detail, let's look at this chart just to refresh our brains here. This is the climate action tracker monitoring. You can see here the blue bar. That's our track. Currently, we're on a 3 degrees track, 3 to 4 degrees warming track, which is a disaster. This is going to change the world if you stay on this track. That's if you're just sticking to current policies. If Paris works, in case the current pledges and NDCs are becoming a reality, we will be on the red track here, which still leads us to a 2.4 to 2.7 degrees increase of warming compared to pre-industrial levels, which is still very heavy in terms of consequences. If you now look at the green, the green sections here, that's the trajectory on which we'd have to be if we want to actually reach the target below 2 degrees or even below 1.5 degrees zero. And the key message here is, if we want to achieve that, we essentially have to decarbonize completely. So the whole world has to go carbon neutral by the end of the century. This is, as you can see, this is probably the most massive transformation that we've ever seen, probably even higher than all the industrial revolutions you have seen in the past. Negative emissions obviously can only be achieved if we include technologies such as carbon capture and storage, but even that is not that's not going to solve it for sure. We need to really tackle all sectors at the same time to reach this ambitious goal. One thing that's very important to see here, and this would warrant another webinar for sure, is that in most cases, reaching these targets, reaching decarbonization, is a fantastically big business opportunity. It creates jobs, and by the way, I should have mentioned that one as well under Trump. Many people forget, and that's a Bloomberg report that recently came out, that currently in the United States, there are more jobs linked to renewable energies than to fossil fuels combined. So if you really want to create jobs or save jobs, you should bet on renewables. And that trend is only going to intensify if we reach this target. Let's look a little bit at some sectors and some specific drivers. First of all, renewable energies. This is an interesting slide because essentially it shows you that we're actually on track. It's doable. If you look at the red bars and the blue bars, you will say, we need a lot of investments, we need to ramp up from 500 to $1 billion a year to 2,500 to 2.5 trillion a year. But if you now look at the green and the purple bar, and here the right scale comes into place, the percent increase, you can see that at the current growth rates, that's actually doable. Investments in renewables are actually growing more or less at figures between 10-20%, which is needed. So it looks like a big hurdle, but actually currently, in case of renewables, we're actually on track. That's really good news. In case of transport, it looks a bit different. In transport, in order to make transport compliant with the 2-degree target, we would need a 40% a year growth over the coming years, and that's a lot. So that's if we want to achieve that, electric vehicles have to go through a curve like the iPhone, for instance, like from one day to the other, more or less, the world is covered. And let's see how that plays out. Growth rates are there, but clearly on transport, something else needs to happen. That what is happening today already. The third driver, and we mentioned this, we discussed about this earlier when discussing Marrakesh, carbon markets and market mechanisms. Carbon markets have led to cheaper emission reductions, and keep in mind we need to decarbonize, so we really have to use all options. The good news is that currently more and more countries, and you can see this on the map on this slide, more and more countries actually do have some sort of carbon pricing in place. Some of them have a carbon market. Others have other systems such as a tax or other schemes. But the likelihood that your operations are some way or the other covered by a carbon price is actually increasing year after year. And a recent report by the World Bank shows that if the world agrees to use carbon markets, so meaning to channel money there where it can achieve the most impact, we could save 33 to 50% of costs simply by doing what is most efficient to do. So carbon markets produce a very massive opportunity to actually get to a decarbonized world faster and cheaper. Another side effect that this has is that at the moment over 1,200 large companies are already doing or about to do an introduction of an internal carbon pricing. So they have, in absence of a carbon price, they already have it internal. And you can see that 83% of them are actually located in places where a carbon scheme is planned already out there. Very obviously, why are they doing it? They're getting ready for a world where a carbon price does exist. So that's another side benefit of carbon pricing. You actually get more pre-compliance action, and more companies who may not even be covered are actually taking action early. A fourth driver I quickly want to mention here is an increasing amount, and here I'm really talking about an iPhone curve. This has just like massively increased over the past 2 years. The quest for transparency of investments. More and more investors want to know how many tons of CO2 they are financing with their investments, and how the portfolios compared to benchmarks in terms of climate change. This is driven also by more and more governments and other bodies requiring transparency. I should mention the French law, which requires every fund above a certain size to actually annually produce a report on carbon emissions. Also, the Californian insurance body has made it mandatory. Nordic governments are working on it, and many other governments as well, to actually make it mandatory to be transparent here. Now that you're transparent, of course, this leads us to trend number 5. Now that you're transparent, you are actually starting to ask questions. So now I know how much tons of CO2 I produce, or to what degree my investments are at risk. You're now going to ask the next question. So how can I invest in low carbon strategy or even do ESG investments? And here, the big news is that the times where you had to make a choice and had to choose between making a profit or basically aligning with the environment, these times are over, completely over. All recent studies show that low carbon strategies certainly don't underperform their benchmark, and actually are quite likely to outperform the benchmark. One example is shown here. the Stoxx Global Climate Change Leaders versus the Stoxx Global 1,800. So there is indication that there is outperformance, but at least, and this is the key message, you can safely invest in ESG strategies, and you're certainly not going to underperform. And that's a very big message, because if that's the case, you will have the mainstream at a tipping point. And actually, this tipping point is already here. More and more classic pension funds, endowment funds, sovereign wealth funds, they are now adapting. They're, first of all, subscribing to being transparent, and second, they are more and more subscribing to low carbon strategies. One element I should note here as well is green bonds. Last year, 2016, this figure is also just out. 81 billion of green bonds have been issued. So the figure of 2015, which you see here on the figure, has again been doubled last year. So green bonds are on an exponential growth curve. Some of you may say, well, green bonds, arguably the rules are not 100% clear yet, and many green bonds, you wonder, what makes them really different from classic bonds. But 80 billion worth of green bonds ensure that this topic is now firmly on the map, and mainstream investors are starting to be very seriously interested. Again, linked to this topic number 5, low carbon and ESG investments, as even one step further, more and more investors start to align themselves with the 2 degrees target. So if the driver for low carbon strategies was actually the avoidance of risk and performance, here, of course, also an element of responsibility comes in, that more and more people who mandate their money to pension funds want to ensure that their investments are placed in line with the 2 degrees targets. One important element here is that, unlike in the years before, we have more better and better data regarding what is actually a 2 degrees compliance strategy. So before, you could always hide behind the fact that this is not known, but thanks to more and more data availability, we have more and more insights as to what that really means. And as soon as you can measure it, you will be sure that more and more products will come to the market that allow you to follow such strategies. And since we're already coming towards the Q&A session, and with this I would like to once again remind you to think about questions. So you have still about 2-3 minutes time to think of your question and put it into the box. I come to another driver that is really of growing importance, which is the Sustainable Development Goals. Again, 2015 was a really exceptional year, because not only did you have basically the agreement in Paris, but in the same year you also had the entry into operation of the sustainability goals, or also global goals. And these goals are basically the sustainability path to 2030. So they're not just going to go away. They're here to stay. And what is interesting is that more and more companies and CEOs the majority of CEOs agree that that business will be the most important driver for delivering the SDGs, but that in turn, the SDGs are also very important drivers for business, because it allows companies to align their strategies with the targets, and it also allows them to work in frameworks of more transparency and therefore also more efficiency. So the global goals, and again, we are only at the beginning. They are currently still a complex topic, and there's a lot of sub-indicators and so on. But the conclusion here is that the global goals are here to stay. They are expiring also in 2030, and over the coming years, we will see more and more direct guidance as to how companies can align in a profitable way with the global goals. So let me now come to the conclusions and takeaway messages here. First, very simple, climate change is not an isolated topic at all. It's very much interlinked. We have touched today issues from state level interventions to Iran to forests. Like it's very much it's a big complex suite of linked issues here. Second conclusion, to avoid climate change and get below 2 degrees, very clearly we need even higher ambition to what we have right now. China, again, China has to act because of their pollution problems. So you will see a lot of leadership from China, not because necessarily they are great environmental leaders, but they have a very serious problem to solve. But along with this problem solving, you will see innovations and you will see advanced technologies, renewable technologies, going even further down the cost curve, changing the profitability levels. Next conclusion, Trump's policy could prove very harmful, but probably not in the direct sense that you may have in mind. So the harm Trump can create is not what you see in his tweets and his PR. The harm he can create is more hidden. And some of Trump's actions may even encourage sustainability innovation. Next conclusion, renewables appear to be unstoppable, especially combined with leaps in storage, supergrids, and China and others driving renewables down the cost curve. Climate risks for investors are now widely accepted, and they have led to a sharp increase in transparency and ESG and low carbon investment alternatives. And finally, the SDGs and the science-based targets, SBTs, are upcoming sustainability drivers, and you will hear much more about those. They've just been launched. More and more guidance will come for corporates how to align with the SDGs. My last and final point is this: be nimble, assess sharply, and don't get sidetracked by PR noise. Analyze what is really on the table and then draw conclusions. With this, I would like to come to the Q&A session, and Franziska is now here again. Franziska Sinner, once again, our head of consultancy. Franziska, what kind of can you select a few of the questions for now?
Reinhard, thanks so much. Yes, I suggest I'll read out a couple of questions. We got a lot, so I'll suggest to read a couple out, which reflect the very diverse questions. You answer, I answer, and then at the end, you can always come back to us by email if a question of you has not been answered and you feel really what Reinhard to comment on it. But I hope we cover a good variety of the questions. And one of a lot of participants actually asked us about the distribution of the PowerPoint slides. And of course, we will, after this, distribute the slides to everyone who registered, together with a survey, where we try to collect a little bit of feedback by you on how you think the webinar was, why you were interested, what topics appealed most to you, so that we get a good understanding of scheduling next webinars and make them more focused, and hopefully in the future you find more interesting stuff which Reinhard can talk about. So yes, you will get the slides. Now the first content-related question. Reinhard, this is on policy. Reinhard, can you talk about how you see European leadership in the climate negotiations and the position of European business in leading climate action?
Well, these are two very different questions, and I start with the bad one first. Policy leadership, as most of you know, Europe has traditionally been the climate leader. European countries are are actually the only countries, by the way, who have signed up to Kyoto 2. So the European Union and a few other countries are the only places in the world which currently have a binding reduction target under Kyoto. But what makes Europe's position currently very tricky is obviously Brexit and the fear of other European nations potentially going the same way. I just had a conversation 2 days ago with a chief negotiator of the European Union. And the problem now is that even for agreeing on improvements or modifications of the ETS, they have always to discuss two options now. Well, what does it mean with Britain? What does it mean without Britain? Because it's not clear what the Brexit really means. So, in short, the Brexit itself may not harm the position too much. The UK itself has been a leader, but it creates a lot of uncertainty and a huge waste of time. A lot of precious time is wasted in designing scenarios rather than actually focus on the topic. But the second part is much more interesting. What can European businesses do? And there, some of these drivers we discussed today are really quite exciting for European business, because keep in mind, European business has been under a European emission trading scheme since more than 10 years. So European business is much fitter than its counterparts elsewhere in the world in a carbon constrained world. So that's already quite interesting. And add to that the drivers that come through the SDGs and the SBTs, where focus is laid on actually making business more efficient, making it more transparent, and therefore actually boost profitability. So I think in this sense, for European business, this move towards climate action is actually really interesting news, because there's multiple ways business can benefit from that move.
Thank you. Thank you. Now I'm trying to combine two questions in one. Reinhard, could you give us an outlook on COP23 and expectations for the year 2017? And on top, or maybe these expectations with a focus on carbon markets, what are the prospects for carbon markets under the Paris Agreement?
So COP23, which is going to happen in Bonn under the leadership of the Fiji Islands, is again not a COP where a big agreement is expected. The big agreement will be in COP24. But as we have seen in case of the Lima COP, which was preceding the Paris COP, Lima and the whole run-up to Paris was extremely important to actually reconcile different positions on conflicting issues that are still outstanding. So COP23 will most likely be another working COP, where you will probably find a few media arguing that nothing has happened. But in reality, it's going to be a very, and I can't stress this, a very important time, the period between now and the end of 2018, and COP23 is in the middle of it, to actually bridge these divides. And once again, we are far from having clarity on how Paris will actually be implemented. And you mentioned carbon markets. It is simply, the rules are not there. And there is considerable disagreement between governments as to what degree carbon markets can actually be used for compliance. So the Paris Agreement clearly states that governments are essentially free to engage and to do with each other and to achieve emission reductions jointly. But at the moment, it's highly unclear how that will be accounted for under Paris. If, let's say, Germany and Nigeria would agree on a joint investment in a Nigerian dam or a solar plant, how would that intervention be accounted under Paris? It's completely unclear. And so without this clarity, a market can't function, especially not a market that is more than just a bilateral agreement, but a multilateral agreement. And that, by the way, adds another complexity. Under the Kyoto Protocol, you had essentially two mechanisms, the CDM and the JI, which were set frameworks with modalities that were agreed at some point, and then the whole world worked the same way. It's currently not clear what role the planned sustainable development mechanism will play, which is in Article 6, and what role simple bilateral agreements will play. Also, that is unclear, and again, how these are accounted. So, summing up, there's a lot of people and a lot of very strong proponents who want markets because, as we've seen in the presentation, it's just so important to make use of these efficiency gains. You can save up to 50% of the costs if you're using markets. So there's strong proponents, but there is also a lot of unclarity, and unfortunately, this is already clear. This year, 2017, we will not have the answer on how the rules, the details will look like.
Okay, the next question is, could you expand a bit on your point regarding the NDCs versus ICAO, or the aviation ambition, or voluntary agreement? And can you elaborate on the potential areas for double counting? What did you mean?
That's an interesting question. So we have to start with realizing that the whole climate negotiations are governed by the UNFCCC, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. That's an independent UN body. However, aviation and shipping are excluded from the UNFCCC. So emissions from the Framework Convention simply says that the International Civil Aviation Organization, the ICAO, should take care of aviation, and the corresponding maritime organization should take care of shipping. Now, this means that you have two UN bodies. One of them is essentially in charge of aviation emissions, and the other one is in charge of everything else. Now, if the UNFCCC has a scheme under which all 195 countries have a target, or at least give themselves a target, the question then is, if you're an airline and under ICAO you have to reduce emissions, where can you do that? Because any emission reductions you do somewhere in one of these countries will automatically interfere with the target of the UNFCCC. So some way these two bodies have to get their act together and create a scheme that is actually that basically doesn't lead to double counting. Because otherwise you could say, well, I'm an airline, I planted trees here in Ghana, so I'm carbon neutral now. But you could say, okay, no, that's not true, because now Ghana has basically reduced emissions, which should be accounted for under Paris Agreement. And what is dangerous about this whole thing, there is currently a lot of drive behind this aviation agreement. And one of the fears we of course have is that in case the UN process moves slowly and cannot come to an agreement 2018, this could unfortunately lead to an aviation deal losing steam. That would be very, very dangerous, because actually the aviation deal is also per se quite ambitious. So the big fear in this sense, and also hope, is that the hope here is that both bodies can get their act together and solve these accounting issues. They are absolutely solvable if only there's political will to solve it.
Okay, and unfortunately, we're running out of time. We really want to make sure we close very soon. So I will ask the last question, which is a little bit also a summary question. So out of the market trends you presented, the 6 or 7, Reinhard, which one do you think, if there is a priority list, which one do you think businesses should focus on?
So I think the key issue here is that in the past, we have seen different calls for actions, pledges, conventions, leadership forum, and so on. And every company has basically chosen a little bit, whatever made most sense. But I think the new, in times of science-based targets, and especially in times of the Sustainable Development Goals, the interesting thing is that we will have frameworks which companies can follow, so that you don't have to choose a priority every year, but you actually align the strategy to be compliant with the SDGs. So, and I found this I found really very powerful to end the fragmentation of different programs and actually gather them under an umbrella where the combination of these priorities comes into force. Once again, this is fantastically helped by another trend which we didn't even elaborate so far, which is the availability of data. In a world where of big data, where more and more actions or non-actions are monitored real time, it is becoming much cheaper and much less of an effort to actually measure environmental and social performance of companies. So if you do not align with the targets, you could be exposed much faster, but if you do align, you also get the feedback much faster. So that's another trend which is helping to basically is helping this momentum that is existing here. Good. So I think we're out of time here. Once again, many thanks for listening in. I wish all of us a high renewable energy year ahead. Please send us your feedback. You will receive a link to the webinar, and please interact. Contact us on Twitter, contact us through other channels, and let's keep the discussion ongoing. And in particular, let's keep the momentum ongoing. Many thanks, and have a great rest of the week.